Thank you for that. And thanks, Greg. Thanks for bringing me here. Thank you all for coming. I've noticed all that you're doing to try to lift up Latino theology here, and very impressive, very impressive. Roberto Goizueta is a very close friend who I think is on your advisory group now. And I noticed you have Justo Gonzalez, one of your own grads, coming with others for your an event in a few weeks. So congratulations, all great stuff. So since this is supposed to be on public religion and public life, I'm going to talk about Latinos and public ritual. And let me begin. I'm going to have a few film clips simply because we can't be talking about ritual and people marching through the streets and have some white guy up here just reading words at you all night. So they're just short clips, but to give some bit of a flavor of what I'm going to be saying, I've selected a few little short things. So let's start with a little example. I'll read part of it and maybe ad-lib some of the other. Asociación Tepeyac de Nueva York. Every year for the last 15 years, they have run what's called the Carrera Internacional de la Antorcha Guadalupana, the International Guadalupan Torch Run. Now, maybe you've never heard of this, but this is a dramatic example now, just so you know where I'm going right now with this part of the talk. They go 3,000 miles from the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe to St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. It takes 2 to 3 months, involves thousands of runners. They go through little towns, stay at churches, community centers. Later, I'm going to show you a small video clip of this. It's a longer clip, but you can watch during the reception if you want. I'm just going to show a little piece of it. But they come all the way up through Mexico, cross into Texas, through the south, up the eastern seaboard, past the White House, arriving in St. Patrick's Cathedral just in time for the Feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe on December the 12th. The runners wear shirts with messages like these, declaring themselves mensajeros de un pueblo dividido por la frontera, messengers of a people divided by the border. And they often tie this in then to the desire to have immigration reform and faith-based pursuit of that. So this is a huge thing. I mean, it's about 3,000 miles, thousands of people as a religious devotion aimed at kind of a public expression of faith in public life. The annual Guadalupan Torch Run illustrates the public dimension of Latino ritual and devotional traditions, faith expressions that often spill out into the streets and plazas of U.S. cities and towns. Like European immigrants from previous generations, more recent arrivals from Latin America and the Caribbean bring treasured expressions of faith with them, such as the Puerto Rican devotion to their patron, San Juan Bautista, the Cuban veneration of their patroness, Nuestra Señora de la Caridad del Cobre, Our Lady of Charity, Guatemalan faith in El Cristo Negro de Esquipulas, a famous black Christ, and El Salvadoran dedication to Blessed Oscar Romero, who even before the Vatican began his canonization process, was popularly acclaimed as a martyr and saint among people in El Salvador. There's other faith expressions. They abound among Latinos. Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, the use of yard shrines and home altars with images of Jesus, Mary, saints, and loved ones. Las Posadas, which literally means dwelling or shelter, a home or neighborhood tradition in which participants accompany with a candlelight procession the pregnant Mary and her husband Joseph on the way to Bethlehem. In locales across the country, Latinos express their devotion to Christ, the Eucharist, Mary, and particular patron saints with processions through city streets, outdoor masses, prayer services, and other manifestations of public devotion. One of the most widespread traditions among all Latino groups is the extensive devotion to the crucified Christ and his suffering mother on Good Friday. Pastors and theologians have rightly deemed commemorations of Good Friday, the day Christ died, the Latino ritual celebration par excellence. Latinos' widespread participation and leadership efforts to organize Way of the Cross rituals comprise their most conspicuous influence on Good Friday worship. These rituals have been prominent in Latin America for centuries, of course, and continue throughout the Spanish-speaking world in places like Iztapalapa, a section of Mexico City, where devotees organize what is reputed as the largest and most ambitious annual passion play in the world today. In many U.S. Latino faith communities, this devotion encompasses a reenactment of Jesus' trial, carrying of the cross, encounter with his sorrowful mother and crucifixion, or simply an outdoor Way of the Cross procession. The ritual usually involves hundreds, if not thousands, of participants processing through neighborhoods and city streets. So let me summarize. I want to leave time for questions, so this is a small group. So let me summarize some of this stuff rather than read all of it. I'm going to try to publish it later so I can send a copy. But one of the things they do, of course, is they see these as a tradition of an encounter with Christ. So you'll hear, like I have a quote here from a man who served as a Roman soldier in San Antonio for a number of years. And he said, the experience becomes so real to me that I feel as I'm right there with Jesus, a Roman soldier whipping him and kicking him. And after participating, he goes, sheds his costume, goes to the church, where I pray a lot and ask forgiveness for my part in the suffering of Jesus. So people get really deeply drawn into this. They're kind of experiencing the lived reality again of that. And of course, another big part of this, and I'll skim over this part as well, it's a deep affirmation of their own religion and culture. You think people who have come as immigrants, not all Latinos are immigrants, many are not. 2/3 have been here already, or at least were born here, but many are immigrants, and they bring these traditions with them, and it's kind of a reminder of home. It's an affirmation in a world that's often hostile to their sense of culture and belonging and identity. These traditions give them the sense that, that they belong and are at home. One commentator after one of the Via Crucis in Texas said, every step down the Via Dolorosa is an affirmation of our past, an understanding of our present, and a courageous entrance into our future. Every year, as the procession winds its way from the market square to the cathedral, a community deepens its roots. So this is just a big reality then, maybe something that we don't always notice, but there's lots of ways religious organizations get involved in public life. Public ritual is a primary way for Latinos, especially Latino Catholics. So tonight, I will assess Latino rituals within the Catholic communities of faith as a means of giving witness to their faith in the American public square. I will examine Latino public ritual through 3 lenses. Those are the 3 points of the talk. Political protest, the way that the rituals blur time and space, and their communitarian theological anthropology. And I'll focus particularly on the most conspicuous of these rituals. I mentioned many of them just now, but I'm especially going to focus on Good Friday, so I don't want Greg to have to pull me off this stage for going too long and talking about everything, so I'll focus on that one. So just a little glimpse. The ones I just described are huge, and it goes through New York. It shows in all the, but most of these, of course, happen in little neighborhoods. They're not on television, they're not well known, they just go on all over the place. So this first little clip, very brief, is just of a people participating in a neighborhood posada. Looks like it's at a church fence. The people on one side are singing, it's a very traditional Spanish song. They're singing in the name of Joseph and Mary, please allow us to come into the inn. And the people on the other side are telling them to go away because there's no room in the inn. So you're not going to maybe understand the words, but that's the basic dynamic. And this song goes back and forth until finally they're granted a place in the poor pesebre. So you just get a sense of the feel of this. It's kind of sacred chaos. It's not very, very carefully designed liturgy. It's just people joining together, children, passersby. My wife is from South Texas. It's a requirement that you sing that song beautifully off key. That's the only way you understand and enter into the beauty of the posada. I've seen it many, many times. So let's just talk about these 3 points. The first one, political protest. Large crowds and the public location of Latinos' Good Friday devotion often draw media coverage, which in a number of instances has focused on the ritual's embodied messages of protest against violence and injustice. The opening line of a Milwaukee Journal Sentinel report observed, quote, the symbolism was blinding as an actor playing Jesus Christ was handed over to be crucified during a Good Friday reenactment on the same St. Anthony church steps where a teenage boy was shot to death last month. This report went on to state that the rituals, quote, prayers and readings drew a line from the suffering and death of Christ 2,000 years ago to the social ills that plague this poor neighborhood today. Outrage at social injustice was the genesis of the annual Way of the Cross in the Pilsen neighborhood in Chicago. On Christmas Eve in 1976, 10 children and 2 mothers died in a fire that swept through an apartment building 2 blocks from St. Vitus Parish. Because they did not understand Spanish, Chicago firefighters who responded to this emergency were unaware that these victims were trapped inside the burning building. In a public meeting following the tragedy, parishioners from St. Vitus and other Pilsen parishes argued that these deaths resulted from a lack of Spanish-speaking firefighters, as well as absentee landlords, overcrowded housing, and city neglect of public services. The following Good Friday, they began their annual Way of the Cross as an expression of faith intended to draw the community together in a collective act of solidarity, and also to remember their lost loved ones and connect their deaths and the plight of the Pilsen neighborhood with the unjust crucifixion of Jesus. Subsequently, the annual procession links the Way of the Cross with, quote, community problems such as housing, crowded schools, immigration, and gang violence. In the words of Father James Colleran, pastor of St. Vitus, the year of the first Pilsen Way of the Cross, the important thing is to relate the stations to what is happening in the community. That's right near Notre Dame. I've walked this one many times, and that's with every station. They're always linking it to something going on, as that description I just gave indicates. Alicia Galvez's study of Mexican immigrants in New York examines El Via Crucis del Emigrante, the Way of the Cross of the Immigrant, conducted through the financial district of Manhattan. The organizers of this Way of the Cross are the leaders of Asociación Tepeyac de Nueva York, an umbrella organization of parish Guadalupe societies that Mexican emigre Joel Magallanes took the lead to establish in 1997 with pastors from local parishes. That's the same group that organizes the Antorcha Guadalupana that comes all the way from Mexico City to St. Patrick's. Undocumented Mexican immigrants are the primary organizers and participants in this procession. The links between Jesus' suffering and that of the undocumented are repeatedly underscored. The procession begins at the offices of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Roman soldiers ordered Jesus to carry his cross with the command, camina, camina ilegal, walk, walk, you illegal one. The prayer booklet for the event states it is dedicated, quote, in memory of those migrants who have fallen in the struggle to survive with greater dignity outside of their land, far from their families. Meditations for the traditional 14 stations of the cross expound on the agony of Jesus and the undocumented, such as the second station that compares Jesus' bearing his cross and suffering undeservedly to the immigrants' cross of separation from their families due to circumstances of poverty beyond their control. Some critics have bemoaned the potential for false hope or fatalism among participants in such devotions, echoing the observation of Catherine Bell that often in rituals, quote, temporary inversions or suspensions of the usual order of social relations dramatically acknowledge that order as normative. So you have a temporary change, but nothing actually changes. It's one of the critiques that can be brought and has been brought against such temporary inversions of the normative order of things. Organizers of El Via Crucis del Emigrante have no illusion their annual prayers and protests will dramatically alter U.S. immigration policy. But of course, they cannot control the expectations for social change that arise among participants in the rituals. A Pilsen Way of the Cross devotees won a small victory when their protests convinced the Chicago Park Department to abandon a plan to flatten the Park Hill where annually they staged the crucifixion. But a few years later, Park Department officials had the hill flattened anyway. Today, devotees are struggling against gentrification in the Pilsen neighborhood, even along the very route of the annual Good Friday procession. I'm trying to limit any chance for romanticization of this. In some instances, Latinos devotees have successfully contested local officials' decrees that thwart their desire to enact the Way of the Cross publicly. And again, in the interest of time, let me skip. This is a case in Cicero where they tried to ban the annual procession. They wouldn't give it a permit. They had originally made a law banning processions and parades in this town to stop the Ku Klux Klan from coming in to have a parade. But then they tried to apply it on the Good Friday. And the local parishioners and their priests said, we'll go to jail before we'll not do this. Eventually, the lawyers of the archdiocese got an 11th hour solution, but it was one of the instances where they very proudly were able to kind of defend their rights, and the public protest aspect resulted in a kind of a political victory. My wife and I went to it that year. There's a very traditional song called Perdona tu pueblo, forgive your people. That year they sang, forgive your town, instead of forgive your people. It was rather beautiful. Some Latinos, it's important to note, have contested what they deem as an overly politicized approach to the way of the cross. Wayne Ashley's study of Good Friday rituals at St. Bridget's Parish on Manhattan's Lower East Side revealed significant tensions between activist Euro-American priests and their Puerto Rican parishioners. Congregants objected to the clergy's overt political messages linked to Christ's way to Calvary, such as in 1991 when one station presented before a mobile gas station included the following prayer reflection. This latest venture, the First Gulf War, was undertaken so that we might have inexpensive gasoline to fuel an American idol, the automobile. Lord, have mercy on us. One woman said such anti-war sentiment had driven many people from the church, especially those who had family and friends in the military. Conversely, she noted that at her hometown parish in Puerto Rico, quote, they put a big tree in the plaza and they put the names of all the people that had gone to the Gulf and lit candles. And nobody died from that town. They all came home safe. That was what we wanted in the church, but he, the priest, wouldn't. Another parishioner assessed the situation more comprehensively. We Puerto Ricans have real religion. We do not involve politics with religion. He, the priest, talks a lot about politics. We want to hear religion. Yet even such critiques underscore that public ritual is a powerful medium for social commentary, in this case evoking Christ's passion and death in ways that provoke participants and observers to consider contemporary issues through a gospel lens. So a little more illustration of this. You're going to see this is a long tape here, so just maybe 2 minutes of it. This is the Antorcha Guadalupana. So you're going to see scenes that start in Mexico. If we had time to watch the whole thing, we'd actually see it arriving in New York. But you'll get a sense of what these people are doing. These are immigrants, both sides of the border, engaging in this devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe as a way of bringing attention to international immigrant issues.
Corona de flores hermosas, Madre Tonantzin, no permitas que yo dude, Virgencita de mi fe. Rocío de la mañana, espinas de mi tiempo, miel de nuestra vida y amargo dolor. Nana Guadalupe, peñón de los milagros.
Excuse me, I think that's actually much more interesting than I am, but in the interest of time here, I'll leave the link with Greg if anybody wants to look at it. That one is actually very, very beautiful, kind of professionally done and very beautifully put together. Let me go to my second point then. Blurring time and space. This maybe is a little bit more unexpected. The first one's kind of obvious. This one is a little bit more, less intuitive perhaps. Many Latino leaders contend that their Good Friday traditions are not merely political protests intended to advocate for social change, but holy events that enable them to endure present hardships with faith and animate them to struggle for the transformation of their personal and collective lives. Karen Mary Davalos' study of Pilson's Way of the Cross encompassed conversations with leaders like Claudia, one of the event's first coordinators, who deemed this public a ritual, quote, the real way of praying, because it offers the opportunity to reflect and analyze how we are living and the things we have to do in order to have a better life. For many participants, the ritual mediates an encounter with God that transcends limiting distinctions like those between religious experience and political activism, our quote-unquote secular age and the sacred time of Christ, Chicago and Jerusalem, Pilsen and Calvary Hill. Another Pilsen leader, Patricia, summed up the power of the event to unite current struggles with those of Jesus. Listen to how she words this. Christ suffered way back 2,000 years ago, but he's still suffering now. His people are suffering. We're lamenting and wailing, and we are a joyful people at the same time. So this is not a story. It's not a fairy tale. It happened, and it's happening now. It happened, and it's happening now. Listen to how they, kind of just break down all barriers of time and space and the way they think about what they're entering into. Internal discord among Way of the Cross organizers accentuates the desire to authentically link current struggles to scriptural precedents. For example, one controversy with the Pilsen Way of the Cross concerned the age of the woman chosen to play the part of Mary. Early organizers had chosen young women, teenagers, or at most in their early 20s, based on the scriptural witness that Mary was a young maiden, as in Luke chapter 1. But subsequently, mothers involved in the procession successfully argued that this is not correct, since Mary had aged by the time the adult Jesus was put to death. I guess this is pretty obvious. Applying Mary's grief to that of mothers who had lost sons to drugs and violence in the neighborhood, communal leader Patricia, previously cited, posed the question that settled the argument. What did she look like when the sword pierced her heart when she saw her son die? What do women look like when their sons die? And thereafter they had middle-aged women, many of whom had lost their own sons, play the part of Mary. These statements illuminate practitioners' notion that their rituals embody a religious experience that transcends time and space. Indeed, mystically unites our current reality and our struggles with those of Jesus. Another interviewer for Davalos' study put it most succinctly, stating that in the Way of the Cross, quote, we are reliving that moment which is actually happening now. We are reliving that moment which is actually happening now. In the Jewish and Christian traditions, of course, the liturgical term for such a notion is anamnesis, which entails making God's saving acts present here and now in ritual. Jewish families and communities do this in the Passover, and Christians do so in the Eucharist. I sometimes tell my students that for Catholics, and for other Christians as well, there's really only one celebration of the Eucharist, the celebration of Jesus and his disciples at the Last Supper. When we celebrate the Eucharist, we're not celebrating it again. We are participating in the Last Supper of the Lord, ritually extended to all times and places, all peoples and cultures. They've deeply got this sense in the way they do their popular devotions. Whether they articulate it in those words or not, this sense is very present in how they go about what they're doing. The sense of anamnesis in public ritual and devotions, of making saving reality sacramentally present, makes these faith expressions a potent means for many practitioners to understand and respond to the struggles of everyday life. A personal example helps illustrate the point. So several years ago, I was invited to a Levantado del Niño celebration, the taking up of the Christ child at the end of the Christmas season. The families gather their friends, and they got Christ in the crib, and you have the final reverence, and then he's taken up. So I went to this people's house and recognized immediately, of course, the manger scene, the usual characters, Joseph, Mary, the Magi, the camels, and so on. But what most caught my attention were other characters, persons I recognized but had never seen depicted in any nativity scene before then. Elizabeth reached out in one of the images with open arms to embrace her kinswoman Mary. Simeon looked with wonder at the child in his arms, while the prophetess Anna raised her eyes and voiced her thanks to God. Jesus' grandparents were also there. I made a fool of myself. I said, who's those couple? They said, theologians from Notre Dame, what do they know? It's Mary's parents, the grandparents. They always show up when a baby's born. Any Mexican mother could have told you that. Other figures recalled the harsh events connected to the story of Jesus coming among us. A Roman official held an open scroll and barked out Caesar Augustus' command that all residents return to their place of origin for the census. One of Herod's soldiers stood with a bloody sword over an anguished mother who embraced the murdered body of her son, one of the holy innocents. The refugees Mary and Joseph hastened on the flight to Egypt, Joseph looking back over his shoulder for signs of unwanted pursuers. This was not the sanitized version of the Christmas narrative to which I was accustomed, but the scandalous, unedited, full biblical account of the Savior's birth. The experience with his family and their manger scene enabled me to see the solidarity of Jesus with today's immigrants, refugees, suffering innocents, and all victims of cruel political forces beyond their control. At the same time, the faith expression of this family enabled me to encounter Christ anew through the devotion of struggling sisters and brothers. Most of all, it impressed on me the shocking scandal that is the Incarnation, the outrageous belief that the Creator of the universe became a child completely vulnerable to the actions of us fellow humans. And I have to confess, I can never look at sweet baby Jesus in the manger scene anymore without remembering this, how shocking the Incarnation really is and what happened when God got here. In other words, the contours of this devotion blurred time and space so that the life of Christ and life today were intermingled in a holy ambience that facilitated transformation of our encounter and response to both. At its best, Latino ritual and devotion vividly provides this experience of anamnesis, of participating in the holy events in a transformative way. Third final point, a communitarian theological anthropology. Another core element of the Good Friday devotion is their prayers and faith expressions are not about just Jesus, but his mother Mary, and even more, about the mutual love of mother and son that death cannot break. Let me skip a little bit of this. After the crucifixion during the evening of Good Friday, Mary's presence becomes even more prominent as devotees turn their attention to the sorrowful mother who mourns her son and lays him to rest in the tomb. While the official Roman Catholic liturgy for Good Friday has no sustained prayerful remembrance of Jesus' burial or of Mary on that faithful night, Latino faith expressions relive these events of the Lord's Passion. I've often wondered about that, you know. We go right from venerating the cross to the Easter Vigil. We don't pass through what happened that night, which for Mary and the taking down of the cross, those are such key moments, and they're not, at least in my tradition, they're not ritualized. But in Latino popular Catholicism, they're extremely ritualized. In some locales, an evening candlelight procession accompanies Mary and the crucified body of her son through the streets around the church, in a devotion known as the Servicio del Santo Entierro, or the entombment service. Then comes the Pésame, or condolences, like a wake service, given to Mary, which often accompanies moving testimonies of mothers and other community members who have lost loved ones and ritually conjoin their sorrow to Mary's. Good Friday connects devotees with Jesus' sacrifice for them, but also with Mary's agony of witnessing her son's passion, with her strength as a woman of faith, with her maternal love for her son and all her children. Focusing on devotions to Mary, such as those of Good Friday, the Posadas, on Marian feasts like Our Lady of Guadalupe, leaders contend Latino faith expressions mediate a communitarian understanding of the human person that shapes Latinos' lives and faith. In the face of an emphasis on autonomous individuals in modern cultures, which clearly influences Latinos as well as others, they're not immune from those influences, the tendency of Latino devotees to accentuate relationships like those between Jesus and Mary presents an alternative vision of what fundamentally constitutes our humanity. The late theologian Adamaria Sacedias asserts that, for Latinos and Latinas, community is not something added on, but a web of relationships constitutive of who we are. Roberto Goizueta concurs, avowing that Latinos tend to derive their sense of identity more from, quote, the community that forms and shapes them than from their life as autonomous individuals. Numerous Spanish language sayings underscore the conviction that a person is profoundly shaped and known through their relationships, such as the popular expression, dime con quien andas y te diré quién eres. Tell me with whom you walk, and I'll tell you who you are. As one Latina parishioner observed to me, for the Latino, we cannot know someone without knowing their family. The first question we ask when we meet someone is, where are you from? Who is your family? I find this to be very true. Often among colleagues of Euro-American background, oh, what do you do? Where do you live? Latinos, that would be insulting to ask you your job. It was like, tell me how much money you make almost, they would feel like. But they always ask you, who is your family? When my mother-in-law meets someone from a town where she has comadres, and the people don't know the comadres, she gets very nervous because she wants that human connection. Do you know someone that I know? So who is your family? That communitarian connection. The communitarian dimension is evident in Latino Good Friday rituals, for which markers of individuality and worldly success are not what matter, since the terrible destiny of Jesus and Mary are already known. Like the expression of condolence Latinos frequently offer at a wake service or funeral, te acompaño en los sentimientos, I accompany you in your sentiments, what matters on Good Friday is faithful accompaniment. Mary and Jesus walk together in their hour of gravest need, while participants ritually imitate what mother and son did at that first way of the cross. Walking with Jesus and Mary, devotees are more intimately joined to the familial circle of their mother-son bond. All this culminates in what Goizueta deems an embodied theology of accompaniment. Latino devotees accompany Jesus and Mary in prayer, particularly in the dark hours of Good Friday, with unwavering confidence that Jesus and Mary will also accompany them in their struggles. Let me just end this little point by saying this. I am not just talking here about family values. Latino families have as many problems as any other families. Teenage pregnancy, drugs, divorce. I'm not talking about some kind of idealized family. What I'm talking about is when they think about what it means to be human, your responsibility to the relationships which form you come first, ahead of any individual achievement. To put it another way, we in this country often raise our children to be independent. I say this as one who has a senior in high school. We raise our children to go out and do it on their own. In Latino communities, while individual achievement, of course, means a lot, what matters much, much more is you fulfill your relational responsibilities. And that defines who you are. The relationships actually make who you are. And the way they relate to Jesus and Mary on Good Friday and other devotions reinforces this communitarian understanding of what it means to be a human being on this earth. I got a conclusion, but one quick little video clip will just show you the Pilsen way of the cross, and just notice the presence of Mary with Jesus in this, that kind of relational aspect of it.
Jesús, al ver a la madre y junto a ella a su discípulo al que más quería, dijo a la madre:
Mujer, ahí tienes a tu
Mary's down there in the lower
hijo.
right-hand corner. So quick conclusion, then we'll still have some time for Q&A. Latino public rituals often draw reactions and participation from non-Latinos on the streets of a number of U.S. cities and towns. Passers-by occasionally gawk at public Way of the Cross processions, and some of them annoy devotees when they, quote, don't even bother to make way for the procession or to turn down their music. That was a quote from the processions in New York, so go figure. A few onlookers even hurl insults. On the other hand, curiosity, the devotional ambience of the events, decisions to conduct some rituals bilingually, and non-Latinos' personal involvement with Latino communities have attracted an increasingly diverse array of participants. Sociologist of religion R. Stephen Warner opens that the power of Good Friday procession and similar public rituals is that, quote, in a society as drenched as ours in symbolic representations, the color and vibrancy of this religious pageantry fills the memories of onlookers with indelible religious images and gives religious messages a competitive edge. Even non-Catholics join in Latino public rituals. Baptist minister Buckner Fanning attested after the San Fernando Cathedral Way of the Cross in San Antonio, when I walked behind Jesus on the Way of the Cross, I wondered what I would have done had I been there. The people of San Fernando drew me into the Passion and put me right there with Jesus. Latino leaders contend their practices provide a viable model for public worship in a society that often accents individual spiritual quests and the privatization of religion, scholars like Stephen Carter have noted. As one pastor put it, Latinos' love for public ritual is a contribution we make to American society. I think there's a hunger for it in American life. It lets you enter into the power of a collective experience. Implicit in such comments is the contention that Latino public ritual provides a model of inclusive pluralism for a society often torn by divisive barriers between peoples and religions. It is a way that churches can fulfill their public role and provide a religious experience that transcends cultural and denominational boundaries. Frequently, ecumenical and interfaith worship services, as well as multicultural events in religious and civic life, tend to focus on the commonalities between diverse peoples and religions, religious traditions, and downplay or ignore their differences. Conversely, Latino public ritual is firmly rooted in a particular ethnic and religious tradition, yet open to the participation of all. As sociologist Warner commented after his first experience of the San Fernando Passion Proclamation, "Many of these rituals were foreign to me. Right in front of us, we saw realistically reenacted the suffering and death of Jesus, the cruelty of his tormentors, and the grief of his mother. There was nothing metaphorical, nothing merely figurative, nothing generic about these rites. Yet as an Anglo and as a Protestant, I did not feel excluded." Nonetheless, the crowds at these rituals still tend to be predominantly Latino Catholics. Moreover, the extent of their future influence on religion and public life in the United States is an open question, with no immediate signs that their influence beyond Latino communities will spread dramatically in the proximate future. And among Latinos themselves, the passing on of these traditions to younger generations is also an ongoing challenge. Still, the growing Latino population and the current widespread practice of such rituals makes them an important feature of religion in the public square. My primary contention this afternoon is that their significance does not lie primarily in the numbers of their practitioners, nor in any concrete policy changes they may be able to effect. Rather, I present these rituals as a style of faith-based engagement, with all the particular dimensions I've outlined, that other religious groups and traditions do well to consider as they strive to witness to their faith in a pluralistic society. So thanks very much, and I look forward to your comments and questions.